Well, the next round of crunch Brexit talks will begin in Brussels this week, with the risk of a stalemate once again if no progress is made by the deadline of the end of June. Now, the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, says the UK has taken 3 steps back from its original commitments and risks a no-deal Brexit at the end of the year. But the UK says if Brussels continues to drag its heels over the talks, then it will walk away in September without a trade or security deal. Neil O'Reilly reports.
No progress and a last chance for an extension. In this latest round of Brexit talks in Brussels, EU and UK officials have to decide if they need extra time to thrash out a deal before the end of the year. But the British are firmly opposed. The pessimism has been reflected in an article by Michel Barnier, the EU's top negotiator, who's accused the UK of going back on commitments made earlier in the separation process. Big differences remain not just on core issues, but on the approach each side is taking to the discussions. Despite a looming recession, Boris Johnson maintains extending the current transition period would betray Brexit voters, as it would keep Britain tied to EU rules.
Whilst the UK might find itself coming out of the coronavirus-induced recession, it might then find that it has a whole set of new and different problems that come from failing to reach an agreement with the EU on trade. So that might result in disruption of supplies. And if you remember the issues we've seen about running down of stocks in supermarkets and all the rest, that's not a good look for a government that's trying to portray itself as providing people with a positive vision of the future.
The coronavirus pandemic has delayed an already tight negotiations timetable. Despite the crisis giving the UK government a reason to request an extension, it appears none will be forthcoming. Neil O'Reilly, Euronews.
Well, joining me from London is Jill Rutter, a senior research fellow at the think tank The UK in a Changing Europe. Hello there to you. Many thanks for joining us. We are hearing just there, both sides are at loggerheads again. But does that mean a no-deal Brexit is likely to be the outcome? Or do you think, even though time is really running short, that this trade deal could be clinched at the last minute?
It potentially could be clinched. It's not going to be clinched at this round of negotiations. And I think, as you said, it's going to go on into the autumn. I think, again, as you said, it's very unlikely that the UK will ask for an extension. Indeed, as made clear, it won't accept one if the EU suggests it would be a sensible thing to do. So I think the question in the autumn is, do the sides move at all, or do they stick? If they stick where they are, then it'll be no deal. But in a sense, one of the things that's quite interesting about the deal that the Boris Johnson government wants is a very different deal to the sort of deal Theresa May's government, the last Prime Minister, would have wanted, is that it's a bit worse than no deal. If he gets his no deal, is a bit worse than the deal he wants. But it's not that much worse. The government has already taken the big hit of leaving the single market, and the customs union knows that there'll be some disruption even with their deal. So the price of failure isn't as high as it once might have been.
OK, that's a very interesting standpoint. So the price of failure isn't as high as it might have once been. We know in July, at least for the moment, that Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President, and Boris Johnson are to meet. Do you think if there are face-to-face talks, that might actually allow some momentum to take place? Maybe even some face-saving momentum to take place when it comes to these talks?
Well, that's exactly what we saw happen last October. If you remember, that deal was unlocked by a face-to-face meeting between Boris Johnson and the Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, and that paved the way to the renegotiation of that bit of the Irish protocol that had caused the passage of the withdrawal agreement to fail 3 times in Parliament before. So it is possible. I think it's very difficult when the negotiators aren't meeting face-to-face. And at the moment, we've had sort of not very much sort of political input. It's been done at a very technocratic level because, of course, all the political leaders are completely tied up with focusing on coronavirus. Brexit's not nearly as high priority in the UK as once it was. It's slipped off the radar screen here. So in other European countries for whom it was never as an important an issue as it was here.
Members that are outside the EU, well, not members, other countries that are outside the EU?
I don't think the UK would pitch itself as seeking other privileges. What it has done is is sort of raid every other free trade agreement or agreement that the EU has ever reached and chosen which bits of those it would like. There are a few areas in which it is asking for sort of, special things, notably on services, on things like road haulage. But all free trade agreements in that sense involve people pressing for what their interests are. So that's not very surprising. And in some areas where you could say it's in the mutual interest to come to a deal, so something like security cooperation, it's clearly in the UK's interest to continue to be part of some of the mechanisms, be able to find a way of playing a role in some of those EU security mechanisms. But equally, it's in the EU's interest for the UK, for example, to continue to supply lots of information into EU databases, because that's really quite significant for both sides. So I think the really interesting thing is, can we be pragmatic enough on some of the sort of ideological sticking points to find a deal that works in the mutual interest? But it may be that the ideology on both sides, the desire by the UK government to have regulatory autonomy, the need for the EU to have reassurances about things like level playing field, role of the Court of Justice, just get in the way. And actually, even though on technical issues you can see quite a lot of progress being made, they may just sort of, mean that both sides in the end have to say, we can't make this thing work.
OK, well, Jill Rutter, many thanks for your analysis.